The galaxy had laughed when the human delegation first revealed its weapons catalog to wider council, a quiet moment at the edge of a vast chamber where ancient species measured power by tonnage and plasma yield, and the humans had stood there with calm faces, while towering envoys murmured amusement at kinetic projectiles, layered armor, redundancy systems, and doctrines built on attrition and adaptability rather than overwhelming first strikes, and that laughter spread across networks and fleets as analysts mocked human reliance on mass drivers, rail cannons, autonomous swarms, and what they call crude but stubborn designs. And on Earth, Admiral Jonathan Hale watched those recordings without anger, knowing that ridicule was a luxury of those who had never faced extinction, and he turned back to the deep black tactical display, where red icons bloomed along the outer colonies, because the Virex combined had decided mockery was not enough, and that humanity's weapons would make excellent salvage after surrender. And so the first shots were fired not in anger but in assumption as a Virex vanguard crossed into soul-adjacent space, expecting a swift demonstration. Their commanders confident that shield harmonics and energy lances would slice through human hulls like paper, and across human space captains like Laura Bennett and Marcus Cole received orders that were calm and precise, not to win quickly but to endure, to observe, to let the enemy commit fully and the first. Battle formed near a dead star where sensor ghosts cluttered the field and the Virex fleet deployed in perfect ceremonial arcs, broadcasting demands that assumed fear, while the human flotilla answered only with silence, engines dim, profiles reduced, and when the opening salvo came it was blinding and loud even in vacuum as energy weapons cracked against layered plating and ablative clouds blossomed outward. And Virex observers noted with satisfaction that several human ships burned and drifted, unaware that burn patterns were controlled, and that each drifting hull continued to fight as power rerouted and crews sealed compartments without panic. And then the humans replied not with a single overwhelming beam, but with thousands of small corrections, rail rounds fired in staggered waves, drones peeling off to confuse targeting, electronic warfare chewing at command links. And suddenly the Virex formations were no longer pristine, as shields flared unevenly and smaller vessels began to vanish in quiet flashes, not explosions, but structural failures as kinetic penetrators did what energy could not. And the mocking tone on open channels shifted as the Virex realized the humans were not trying to impress, but to dismantle, and from a command deck light years away, Ambassador Helen Moore listened as reports arrived, her voice steady as she authorized escalation protocols that the Council had dismissed as theatrical, and in the midst of the battle, Captain Cole ordered a maneuver that alien tacticians had long declared obsolete, closing distance under fire, trusting armor and redundancy. And when his ship rammed through a Virex cruiser's shield envelope and fired point blank, the shock rippled through both fleets as doctrine failed in real time, and the first battle did not end with single decisive blast, but with silence as wreckage drifted and surviving Virex ships withdrew in disarray, their commanders stunned by losses they could not explain, and across the galaxy the recordings replayed without laughter now, analysts pausing frames where human weapons did not shine or glow, but simply worked, again and again, until mockery died and something colder replaced it, the understanding that the first battle had ended, and with it the illusion that humanity fought the way the galaxy expected, because what had seemed simple and crude had been built for a long war, and this was only the beginning. In the days that followed the first battle, the galaxy tried to explain away what had happened, and commentators on distant worlds spoke carefully now, calling it an anomaly, blaming inexperienced Virex commanders or unlucky sense interference. Yet inside human space there was no celebration, only preparation, because Admiral Jonathan Hale understood that mockery turning to caution was more dangerous than mockery itself, and he ordered every fleet to assume the enemy would adapt quickly, while Captain Laura Bennett oversaw repairs that revealed just how close the fight had been. Scorched armor peeled back to show intact internal frames. Systems brought back online through rerouted pathways that human engineers had insisted on for generations. And as crews worked while complaint the news spread that the Virex combined had not retreated in shame, but regrouped in anger, their ruling syndicates furious at the loss of prestige, and demanding a response that would restore fear and far. Beyond the frontier, Ambassador Helen Moore stood again before the Galactic Council, where laughter had vanished entirely, replaced by a strained politeness as envoys asked questions they should have asked years ago about human logistics, production capacity, and casualty tolerance, and Moore answered honestly but selectively, explaining that humans had built their weapons not to intimidate neighbors, but to survive neighbors. And that statement unsettled older species who had long relied on intimidation alone. And within the Virex hierarchy, a commander named Crawl, scarred and methodical, reviewed battle footage frame by frame, noting not the weapons themselves, but the human behavior under fire, the lack of panic, the refusal to disengage when doctrine said they should, and he realized with growing dread that the humans had not revealed their full strength because they had not needed to, and so the Virex prepared a second strike larger and louder, designed to crush morale, while human planners anticipated this and quietly shifted civilian populations, hardened supply routes, and activated reserve crews who had trained for decades without ever expecting to be called. And Marcus Cole, promoted despite his damaged ship, briefed younger captains on what he'd learned, telling them that the enemy believed fear was a weapon and that the surest way to break them was to deny it. And as fleets moved again, the galaxy watched with held breath, understanding now that the first battle had not been a fluke but a test, and that the next encounter would decide whether humanity was a curiosity to be managed or a force that would reshape the balance of power forever. The second engagement unfolded in a region of contested space known among humans as the Iron Verge, a dense asteroid belt where sensor readings flickered and communications lagged, and the Virex fleet advanced with confidence, their energy lances and plasma rays forming a glittering wall meant to intimidate, yet the humans had anticipated the overconfidence and deployed their own traps, mining the grav fields with autonomous deterrent arrays that could not be seen until activated, and as the first Virex cruisers entered the zone, the arrays detonated in a controlled cascade, sending shrapnel and electromagnetic pulses in unpredictable patterns that tore through shields and guidance systems without a single human ship taking critical damage. And Captain Laura Bennett maneuvered her vessel through the chaos, issuing comm commands as drones deployed in swarms to jam sensors and mislead targeting, while Admiral Jonathan Hale observed from the command nexus that human crews displayed near-perfect cohesion, redirecting power to damaged sectors, rerouting ammunition, and performing repairs mid-combat with a speed that alien analysts could not comprehend. And the Virex commanders, accustomed to submission and quick victories, began to issue frantic orders that contradicted one another, their formations breaking as humans exploited every weakness with surgical precision. And amidst the confusion, Marcus Cole led a strike group through a narrow passage of the asteroid field, using gravitational anomalies to shield their approach. And when they reached the core of the Virex formation, they unleashed a coordinated salvo of railguns and kinetic projectiles that penetrated multiple cruisers simultaneously, tearing hulls apart and disabling key command nodes. And across the belt, the once proud Virex fleet began to fracture, some ships retreating blindly into debris, while others fell into patterns humans could predict and manipulate. And as the battle raged, Ambassador Helen Moore monitored communications from captured channels, noting the language of panic spreading among Virex officers, and she issued concise directives that prioritized human advantage and enemy miscalculation. And when the dust settled, debris scattered across the asteroids like a metallic graveyard, the surviving Virex ships limping away, their losses far greater than any previous engagement. And the galaxy began to murmur in disbelief that humanity had not only survived but dominated in. Encounter they were expected to fail, and in human space there was still no celebration, only quiet acknowledgement that the first shock had been absorbed, and the true test of endurance and strategy was only just beginning as intelligence suggested the Virex combined would soon call upon every fleet in their reach to reclaim honor and prove that humans were not invincible. Yet the humans prepared, patient and unshaken, knowing that they had already rewritten the rules of galactic conflict with the cold efficiency of experience, foresight, and an unyielding refusal to surrender under fire. The aftermath of the Iron Verge spread to the galaxy like a slow shockwave as independent systems, trade leagues, and minor powers replayed the battle data in private, no longer trusting the public summaries issued by the Council, and within the Virex combined the political fallout was immediate and brutal. Syndicate leaders accusing one another of incompetence, while military advisors warned that the humans were learning faster than expected. Yet pride outweighed caution, and a decision was made to commit a grand armada meant not just to defeat humanity, but to restore the narrative of inevitable Virex dominance. And Admiral Jonathan Hale anticipated this shift, recognizing the pattern of empires that doubled down after humiliation. So he authorized Operation Stonewall, a strategy built on layered defense and counteroffensive traps rather than a single decisive clash. And across human territory, shipyards increased output around the clock, not with exotic new weapons, but with proven designs refined for faster assembly and easier repair, while civilian industries were quietly integrated into wartime logistics, something alien observers had never fully understood because they did not separate survival from daily life the way humans did, and Captain Lorbent was assigned to command a defensive line near a cluster of inhabited systems, coordinating militia fleets and professional crews alike, discovering that even civilian pilots adapted quickly to combat protocols, following orders with discipline born from shared risk rather than fear of punishment. And as the Virex Armada advanced in overwhelming numbers, their broadcasts returned, no longer mocking but threatening annihilation, promising that human resistance would be remembered only as a brief inconvenience. And Marcus Cole listened to those messages from the bridge of his rebuilt ship, noting how desperation now crept into the cadence. And he reminded his crew that an enemy who needed to speak so loudly was already unsure, and when the Armada finally struck, it did so across multiple fronts, overwhelming sensors with scale alone. But the humans did not meet them head-on, instead falling back in calculated stages, drawing Virex forces deeper into regions where supply lines stretched thin and coordination faltered, and at each step human ships inflicted damage, then withdrew, not retreating in panic, but shaping the battlefield, and alien commanders began to argue as their advance slowed, unsure why victory felt increasingly distant. And in the council chambers, Ambassador Helen Moore delivered a brief statement that echoed through every diplomatic channel, stating simply that humanity was no longer seeking recognition or approval, only space to exist without threat, and that any force attempting to deny that would be met with resistance until it understood the cost. And as the Grand Armada pressed on and human defenses held, the galaxy began to grasp a new truth, that the war was not being decided by who struck hardest in a single moment, but by who could endure pressure without breaking, and in that contest humanity was proving terrifyingly difficult to exhaust, turning every kilometer of space into a lesson the Virex had never learned, that power measured only by numbers meant nothing against an enemy who planned for the long fight and refused to be rushed into defeat. As the war dragged into its next phase, the Virex Combined began to feel something unfamiliar, not defeat but uncertainty, a corrosive doubt that spread through command structures as reports grew contradictory and projections failed to align with reality, and Admiral Jonathan Hale exploited this with precision, ordering targeted strikes not at the largest fleets, but at logistics hubs, relay stations, and repair yards that the Virex had never needed to defend properly because no enemy had ever reached them before, and suddenly entire sectors of the Armada found themselves short on fuel, munitions, or reliable communication, forced to slow or halt while human raiding groups struck and vanished, and Captain Laura Bennett coordinated with intelligence officers to rotate frontline crews before exhaustion set in, a practice alien strategists had dismissed as wasteful but which kept human performance consistent, while Marcus Cole led deep penetration missions that relied on human pilots, trusting instinct and training when sensors went dark, threading through hostile territory with minimal support and returning with critical data or not at all. And within the Virex ranks, commanders like Krall argued fiercely for adaptation, urging withdrawal and reassessment. But political overseers demanded visible victories to maintain internal control, forcing the military to continue offensives that no longer made sense. And the result was fragmentation as some fleets pressed forward aggressively while others hesitated, creating exploitable gaps the humans immediately identified and used, and across neutral systems of perception of humanity shifted decisively, no longer seen as reckless upstarts, but as a calculating force that understood war as a system rather than a spectacle. And Ambassador Helen Moore received discreet inquiries from powers that had once voted against Earth, asking what terms neutrality might require, and she responded with restraint, making no promises, but making clear that humanity remembered who had mocked and who had stayed silent. And as months passed, the human economy bent but did not break, civilian populations adapting to rationing and extended alert states with grim acceptance, while the Virex home sectors experienced unrest as trade faltered and confidence eroded, and analysts across the galaxy began to write the same conclusion in different words, that the first battle had ended the laughter, the second had ended the dismissal, and now this prolonged struggle was ending the myth of Virex inevitability, because humanity was not winning by overwhelming force, but by denying the enemy the kind of war they understood, replacing quick dominance with grinding pressure. And as Admiral Hale reviewed the latest projections, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection, knowing that victory was still distant and costly, but also knowing that the balance had irreversibly shifted, and that the galaxy would never again look at human weapons or human patience the same way. By the time the conflict entered its sixth major cycle, the war no longer looked like anything the Virax Combined had planned for, because instead of a clear front, there were dozens of contested zones where human forces appeared, struck, withdrew, and returned again with subtle variations that forced constant recalculation, and Admiral Jonathan Hale leaned into that instability, approving decentralized command authority that allowed captains to act on local intelligence without waiting for high-level approval, something alien militaries feared because it reduced political control. Yet for humans, it accelerated response time and rewarded competence, and Captain Laura Bennett became a focal point of this approach as her sector turned into a proving ground where mixed fleets of regular Navy, reserve crews, and retrofitted civilian vessels worked together seamlessly, sharing data and covering one another's weaknesses, while Marcus Cole survived an ambush that should have killed him when his ship lost main power deep in hostile territory, only to drift silently for hours before restarting minimal systems and escaping by timing his burn to a debris surge, an act that became required study material across human academies not because it was heroic, but because it demonstrated calm problem-solving under failure. And within the Virax hierarchy, the strain finally cracked into open division as military commanders blamed syndicate leaders for forcing impossible objectives, while the syndicates accused the military of exaggerating human strength to cover incompetence. And Krall, now sidelined for his earlier warnings, watched as younger officers repeated the same mistakes he had documented, overcommitting to frontal assaults and assuming humans would break under pressure. Yet the humans did not break. They adapted, rotating crews, updating tactics, and feeding lessons learned directly back into production and training loops, shortened the gap between experience and improvement to a degree the galaxy had never witnessed. And Ambassador Helen more quietly leveraged this momentum in council chambers, where votes began to shift, resolutions once hostile to Earth now stalled or failed entirely, as neutral powers reconsidered the cost of antagonizing a species that had demonstrated both restraint and resolve. And the turning point of this phase came not with a massive battle, but with the sudden collapse of a Virax regional command when its supply web was severed. Over a span of days, leaving thousands of ships stranded or surrendered without a fight, and the images of Virax captains powering down weapons and requesting terms spread faster than any victory broadcast, because surrender had once been unthinkable for them, and across human space the response was controlled and methodical, prisoners processed, ships secured, no public triumph declared, reinforcing a message that humanity was not seeking humiliation but compliance, and that quiet efficiency unsettled observers more than rage ever could. And as Admiral Hale reviewed casualty lists and fleet readiness, he understood that the war had crossed a threshold, because the enemy was no longer asking how to defeat humanity, but how to survive the consequences of having underestimated it. And that realization marked the moment when the balance of fear finally shifted, not through spectacle, but through sustained, undeniable proof that human weapons were only one part of a much larger system the galaxy had failed to recognize until it was far too late. The realization that spread to the Virax Combined after the regional collapse was not immediate panic, but a slow draining away of certainty, as commanders began to issue orders that prioritized survival over conquest, and this subtle shift did more damage than any battlefield loss because it signaled to every subordinate that the old assumptions were dead, and Admiral Jonathan Hale recognized the opportunity, directing intelligence units to amplify confusion rather than fear, feeding the enemy accurate but incomplete information that forced them to question every report, while human fleets increased tempo just enough to keep pressure constant without exposing themselves to reckless risk, and Captain Laura Bennett found herself negotiating localized ceasefires with stranded Virax groups who no longer believed relief would arrive, establishing protocols that treated surrender as a logistical problem rather than a moral victory, which further eroded the enemy's ideological cohesion. And Marcus Cole, now commanding a task force of mixed experienced crews, executed a series of coordinated feints that drew remaining Virax heavy units into defensive postures, immobilizing them without decisive engagement and effectively removing them from the war. and within Virex core space unrest intensified as syndicate leaders faced economic collapse and internal dissent, their promises of swift dominance exposed as hollow, and Krall, recalled from obscurity, was tasked with drafting an assessment no one wanted to read, outlining in clear terms that the humans had not relied on any single technological advantage, but on an integrated approach that combined doctrine, culture, and adaptability, making simple countermeasures ineffective. And when that assessment leaked through neutral channels, it reached the Galactic Council, where Ambassador Helen Moore spoke less than ever, letting the facts speak for themselves as former critics struggled to justify earlier votes. And across the galaxy, smaller powers began aligning policy with the expectation that humanity would be a permanent strategic factor, not a temporary anomaly. And the decisive moment of this phase came when a Virex attempt to stage a symbolic counteroffensive collapsed before it began. Their fleets dispersing after conflicting orders left them vulnerable to isolation, and human forces declined pursuit, allowing the failure to stand unchallenged, a restraint that confused observers but sent a clear message to the enemy leadership that further escalation would only deepen losses. And as the war's momentum slowed into an uneven stalemate tilted firmly against the Virex, analysts finally agreed on what had become obvious, that the first battle had ended mockery, the following campaigns had ended resistance, and now the long, grinding reality of human persistence was ending the will to fight itself, setting the stage for a conclusion that would not be decided by a final explosion, but by the acceptance of a new order the galaxy had never planned for. The end of the war did not arrive with a grand declaration or a burning world, but with a sequence of quiet decisions made across Virex space as syndicate leaders, stripped of certainty and surrounded by evidence they could no longer deny, authorized envoys to seek terms not of victory, but survival, and Admiral Jonathan Hale received those signals without celebration, assembling a small delegation that included Ambassador Helen Moore and several senior commanders not to demand surrender in spectacle, but to define boundaries that would prevent the war from ever needing to be fought again. And when the negotiations began, they were stark and factual, humans outlining ceasefire lines, demilitarized zones, reparations measured not in humiliation, but in reconstruction aid, and enforced limits on future expansion. Conditions that stunned observers because they revealed humanity's objective had never been conquest, only security. And within the Virex delegation, figures like Krall listened, in silence, recognizing that the humans were imposing a framework rather than taking revenge, a framework that acknowledged power realities without erasing the defeated, and as agreements were finalized, fleets powered down across contested regions, weapons locked, channels cleared, and for the first time in years the stars grew quiet, and the galaxy watched as human forces withdrew to define borders instead of advancing, confirming what many had begun to suspect, that humanity's strength lay, not just in how it fought, but in knowing when to stop. And in the council chambers, Ambassador Helen Moore delivered a final address that contained no threats, only a simple statement that humanity would defend itself with everything it had, but preferred a galaxy where such defense was unnecessary. And that sentence carried more weight than any display of force, and in the aftermath, trade resumed cautiously, alliances shifted, and military doctrines across dozens of species were rewritten to account for lessons learned too late. While on Earth and its colonies, life slowly normalized, veterans returning to rebuild rather than parade, and Admiral Hale retired quietly, leaving behind a strategic doctrine that would be studied for generations. And as historians later summarized the conflict, they did not mark its beginning with the invasion or its end with a treaty, but with the moment the galaxy had mocked human weapons, because that mockery revealed a misunderstanding far deeper than technology, a failure to grasp that humanity did not design its tools to impress others, but to endure against impossible odds. And by the time the first battle ended, that misunderstanding was already fatal, because the galaxy had learned at great cost that humans did not need the brightest weapons or the loudest threats, only the patience to keep fighting until their enemies understood exactly who they were dealing with, and that understanding reshaped the balance of the stars in a way no one could ever undo.